This episode of Midlife Men includes open and honest discussions about mental health challenges, including suicide. Some listeners may find this content distressing. If you or someone you know is struggling, please consider seeking support from a qualified professional or mental health service. Examples given at the end of the episode. Welcome to the Midlife Men podcast with me, Philip Briscoe. Today, in this episode, I'm joined by Frederick. Chris is a mental health advocate, global citizen, and lived experience advisor, and he's also a mad Star Wars fan. Through his Project Soul Stride, he focuses on the unique needs of black men experiencing suicidality and mental health challenges in the UK. Chris himself is a suicide attempt survivor. Well, welcome to the Midlife Men podcast, Chris. Thank you for coming on.
Very welcome. Good to see you.
Perhaps we could start, and we always kind of start here, perhaps you could talk a bit about what it was like growing up. What was your early life like, Chris?
Yeah, well, it's quite a long time ago, Philip. It's been a long old while, eh? So, I was born in Wembley, northwest London, a stone's throw from where I'm living now. So I've kind of gone full circle. Born at Wembley Hospital, Park Royal Hospital, grew up in a pretty rough estate, Chalkhill estate, which was brought down many years later because it became like Southeast England's biggest drug sort of haven, So my father, and I was, born a twin as well. So, parents are both very young from the Caribbean. My mother came over from Grenada when she was 16. And my father came over from Dominica when he was 8. So they were both really young, they had a lot of responsibilities, and it was tough growing up. I mean, my father was very protective. He was, as most, a lot of sort of black men would identify with this, that sort of generation, that Windrush generation of fathers coming from the Caribbean, their style of fatherhood was pretty tough. And as a result, we had a lot of, issues. Won't go into too much detail, but a lot of issues, which, eventually have manifested themselves in later life, which has led to, some of the challenges that I still have today. So, at age 11, we relocated from what was an ethnic majority community, like really, to completely the opposite. At age 11, we moved to a suburb of London, Chislehurst in Kent. And, we got into school, decent school, public school, Kemnal Manor, played a lot of rugby, played cricket, participated in the school athletics team. I mean, we were both big lads. But what was really interesting as well is that we were only two of like half a dozen non-white pupils in the entire school. So as you can imagine back then, Phil, racism was rife, not only on our street, Olmsted Avenue. We were probably, I think, one of two non-white families living on the street. So we had to contend with that coming home, going to school. Then we had to contend with racism in school. So the way that we sort of got through that, at least I did anyway, was, studying martial arts. My dad was really big on karate, and, playing a lot of sport. So nobody tended to mess with us, but it still took its psychological toll. So so there's a little bit of a background in terms of growing up there. Yeah.
So this was the 1980s, I guess, when you were at school.
Exactly.
And so you talked about how it started to manifest, your behavior started to manifest, as you got a bit older, what were the kind of symptoms that you were experiencing?
Yeah. I mean, I think when my mum left, when we were about 13, that for me was the real turning point, because, as twin boys, it was, I was always seen as my mum's son, and my brother Colin was always seen as my dad's son, quite similar characters. So when my mum left, I really felt alone. And even with having a twin in the house, which was the main reason why I stayed with my dad, because my twin was staying there, it was fairly obvious that as twins, our lives were going in very different directions. And what I mean by that was that he was very academic, very studious. I was not. I was a bad boy at school. I mean, if there was trouble, I'd be right in the middle of it. And I think for me, that was a coping mechanism because, for me to feel accepted by, my white mates, and the tougher ones among them as well, it felt like I couldn't compete with Colin academically. So the only way I could sort of stand out in the crowd was being a bad boy. So if there was ever any trouble, or teachers were, my French teacher was crying because I locked her up in the school cabinet, in the cabinet once in the classroom. She hated my guts. It was awful things. But, and if the cane was coming out, I'd be one of the first few to get the cane, So I got kicked out of school, no qualifications. Colin went on. Our relationship dissolved after then. And to be frank with you, Phil, it's something I know is still missing, really missing in my life today. I have very little, if any, contact with my twin. And you get to that point in your life where you feel like, particularly at this stage, older part of your life, you feel like having that relationship with a twin could have made a lot of difference. It could have changed my life. And I still feel really sad about that, to be honest. And so when I left school, I went straight out into work. I didn't know what I wanted to do. And I started to realize, I think I was 19. I started to realize at the back of my head, that my hair was falling out because I had a little bit of a fro. Going on back then. And, but I started to feel like these really soft bald patches. So I'd go to the doctor and he said, "Oh, you've got alopecia." And I was like, "Oh, what's all that then?" He goes, it's actually brought on by stress. Right. So I said, "Oh," and so I took him through my life and he said, "Oh, well, you got a lot to be stressed out about. Do you want to speak to a counselor?" I was like, "No, I mean, like back then I was like, oh, you must be kidding. I'll sort it out." In fact, I said, "I'll just start shaving my head." So if you could see me now, I'll shave my head from that day. In there, they'd inject steroids in there. We'd put cream on there. And what was weird is the hair started to grow back after a while. So it'd grow back up. Whereas the rest of the hair was flat, and I'd have these really thick tufts of hair on the back of my head. And then at age 30, it started again when I was in Hong Kong. So you could almost sort of, if it was a graph, you say, okay, these were some of the most stressful times in my life. And that's when the alopecia started to happen. So that's really was my first experience and knowledge of what that meant to me physically. So yeah.
You rejected then kind of counselling or help. Do you think that was, of the time, was it environmental? Because I guess that was what the turn of the century sort of time.
Yeah, I mean, listen, obviously we know all about that now, what counselling means to us and, what the positive and potentially negative impacts will be. But back then, to be honest, there really wasn't much knowledge around. And so, I just rejected the idea out of fear because I didn't want to talk to a stranger about anything that happened in my life. I thought it was private. And if the cost of that was my hair falling out, and that was the cost I was willing to bear. So, yeah.
And how did you what took you to Hong Kong?
Yeah, well, I'd already got into the recruitment industry at age sort of 21, and found I had a flair for it because I was an academic. I didn't have all the degrees. And, back then it was, we were going through an era where if you didn't leave school with a good degree, a good sort of set of A levels and maybe a degree here or there, you were always pretty much back of the queue, in terms of what we perceived to be really good paying, decent career path roles. So I ended up getting into recruitment. I was in financial services, selling, cold calling. I was good at that. And then my boss at the time invested in a startup recruitment firm with his brother. And he said to me, "Oh, Chris, you'd be the ideal guy to get it started for us." And I was like, "Hold on, I don't know anything about recruitment." He said, "Oh, it's fine. We'll stick you on a 30-day course and then you'll be up and running." I was like, "Oh, that all sounds good if you're going to pay me a decent wage." And next thing I know, I was finding an office at the bottom of Harley Street in London, and I was getting the company registered. And I was thinking, if nothing more, what a great learning experience for me at such a young age. And I went through into IT recruitment, which was the real in thing at that time. And then my buddy from Hong Kong rang me and said, Chris, I've been out in Hong Kong for the last 9 months. I'm making a packet. And we've got vacancies and they want boys from London. I said, I'll be on the next plane. And literally I went out there with my girlfriend, came back 3 days later with an offer letter in my hand. And 2 months later, I was on a plane to Hong Kong, and that was it. Never looked back.
So how was you, because I know you said your alopecia started again when you were in Hong Kong. So how was your mental health as this took place?
Yeah, well, I mean, listen, talking frankly, I mean, the girlfriend that I took with me on the plane, the whole plan was that I'd go out there for the first 3 to 6 months and then she'd come and follow because, we were in love. At least I thought we were anyway. I only realized when I came back after about 6 months, I came back to visit and, one of my best mates picked me up at the airport and we had a whole weeks of drinking and partying scheduled. And then I realized when I got back to Hong Kong that he and my girlfriend had been having an affair. And I was like, that's when the alopecia started. That's when, and I can only laugh about it now, but at the time I could tell you I had some very sinister thoughts about what I might do if I ever saw them again. And it turned out they actually ended up having kids together. So good luck to them. I don't think they're married anymore. But anyway, that was again a turning point. So what started off was a nice, beautiful plan. Go there, she'd come, we'd set up, we'd maybe get married. Suddenly, it was like I was really on my own now in Hong Kong and had to make the best of it. The dot-com boom came, shed loads of cash, and then it crashed. And then that's when I started to experience the volatility in the recruitment sector. And that unfortunately is part and parcel of being in that industry for almost 28 years. I was in that space for.
And so how did, the things you experienced growing up, when you reached, your adulthood, you're into your 30s, did you feel that, they came back to haunt you? Had you dealt with it? I imagine the answer is no, really. How do you deal with it? But did you find that, it was unresolved and was still impacting you, even though you might not have realized it?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, those issues, those obstacles, you find a way to park them away into these little boxes in your brain and you lock them up and you hope that sometimes they never reappear. And what you start to do is you find, as I did, I started to sort of, imagine if it was a box, we buried it in the sand. I just started to pile more and more sand on it. And all that sand, Phil, was money. It was holidays. It was women. It was working flat out career wise and trying to get through and upwards into the, higher echelons of leadership. And you feel as though, okay, as you're distancing yourself from what's in those boxes, you feel like, okay, I've escaped them now, and they're buried forever, and that's fine. But actually, you soon realize it doesn't take a lot for those boxes to open. And when they do open, it's all a matter of timing. For me, it was attempted suicide. I mean, I had thought about it for a long time before I attempted it. And then when it actually happened in my apartment in Singapore, in August of 2018, it was awful. I mean, I think about it. I talk about it now and I think about it and I think, what were the influences? And you know what it was, Phil? It was, and it might sound stupid, but I think it's worth saying on your podcast is that during that summer, Anthony Bourdain had taken his life in the hotel room. Do you remember that? He took his life at a hotel room. His daughter was downstairs waiting to have dinner with him. He was there doing his thing. And here's a hero of ours, took his life. And then there was that other really lovely, women's handbag and shoe designer. Kate Spade. Was it Kate Spade? It was, wasn't it? It was. And she took her life, I think, in the same summer season. Again, And so I was seeing these images, these stories coming through CNN, and it started to, those ideas started to embed themselves. And when I realized after I'd lost my last job in Singapore that you kind of realize as an expat after kind of 25 years, you kind of realize maybe your time's up unless you are nationalized, unless you've got citizenship and, or you've been married to a local and you've got a kid. If you're still doing the high life as I was, and then suddenly you fall off that ledge after so long, it really gets it. Enough is enough. And so I always used to joke with my ex-girlfriend. I used to say to her, I wonder how many expats are forced to go back home and then attempt suicide because their life so radically changes. It's like everything they dreamed of comes to a screeching halt. And I was one of those people. I didn't, the worst thing for me, Phil, was thinking about going back to London. I only ever visited London once every 3 years when I was away. So only a handful. So I didn't want to be there. The thought of going back there with nothing was more than I could bear, mate, to be honest. And I said, you know what? Best option. Let's check out.
Did you talk to anyone at the time? Do you think it would have helped if you had?
Listen, I didn't, mate, to be honest, because I was really on my own. I'd split up from my girlfriend. I'd lost my job. And, you know, when you are an expat, it's quite a transient life. You know, you might have a friend here or you might have a friend in this country or that, and they've got a lot of their own things going on. And I really didn't feel as though at the time I had that kind of real connection with anybody that I could tell that story to. I mean, I say that, I mean, there were two people who I ended up staying with in Los Angeles. I mean, I tell you what happened, right, is that before I attempted this, the night, I sent out 3 WhatsApp messages. One was to my ex-girlfriend because I wanted her to feel guilty. That, I'm telling you honestly, right? I wanted her to feel guilty, right? One of them was to another old dear friend of mine. And another one was to my best friend, Marina, in Los Angeles. And at the time, she was shopping at the supermarket. And she'll tell you now, she got the WhatsApp message, and all the message said was, I love you. And she dropped her bags and ran out of the supermarket and called her husband Rob and said, something's wrong with Chris because he's just sent me this message. We haven't heard from him for a while. He's only said these 3 words. And she got instinct that I was about to do something. And so the next morning when I rang her, because she'd been trying to leave messages all night, she knew exactly from LA, Phil, she knew what I was going to do. And I wish I'd spoken to her before, but you can't change the past. I mean, what we went through afterwards and how she and her family helped me, I'll never forget it. It's changed my life. Saved my life, actually, yeah.
As you're being so honest with us, Chris, can I ask you this question? Do you think you actually wanted to end your life, no longer exist, or do you think it was a reaction to not wanting to go home, not knowing what to do? Because there's a difference, isn't there? I mean, I guess at the time, I guess you weren't making that difference in your head?
No, I mean, okay, it's a fair question and it's a good question because I've attempted suicide twice. And to be honest with you, the first time was a cry for help. It was a shout for help. And I got the help that I needed back then. Okay. The fact that incident, I made it last for so long meant that maybe my heart wasn't fully in it. But fast forward to April of 21, when I tried again, a different method, which we won't talk about now, but when that didn't work, I was royally pissed off because I was utterly convinced from the research I'd done and from the method I had selected and the way in which I wrapped up my affairs, it could not have been cleaner. And it was absolutely, it should have happened. And I think one of the main reasons it didn't happen was because, I won't even say, okay, because it might give away the method. But put it this way, when I saw at Ealing Hospital and I saw the psychologist afterwards, and she said, "How are you feeling? Are you glad to be alive? Are you glad you're with us?" And I said to her, "No." I said, "Actually, I'm quite pissed off." I was quite deliberate. I said, because that should have worked. So, I hope that answers your question, because they are two very different incidents. Not, yeah.
And let me ask you another question. And the whole point of this podcast is to ask uncomfortable questions and make them comfortable. In your opinion, when you've got very high profile people that do take their own lives, like the two people you mentioned earlier, do you think that, I have to be careful, do you think it almost romanticizes it a bit? It's almost makes it something which people think, well, I could do that then, because, other people are doing it, high profile people are doing it. Do you think people are not really thinking, well, actually, that's a very final act? What do you think? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a good question. I mean, I'll tell you, when I saw what happened to those two individuals, I started to do so much research. It was unhealthy research, and I was absolutely staggered by the amount of celebrities who had taken their lives over the years. And these were from young, aspiring actors who I didn't even know had died, to much older individuals. And actually, the list became quite extensive. And as I would go through that list, I'd be thinking, God, I really miss that person. I'm really sad that person's gone. And I started to think about how would people feel when I'm gone? And then you're right. The idea of people saying goodbye and being regretful of not being able to help, that the romance of that made me feel needed and wanted, regardless of how I would get there or how they might get there. It actually, that at the time, it sounds bizarre, but that at the time meant more to me than actually being alive.
So looking back now, Chris, on both of those events, you talked a bit about your good friend knew something was wrong, but looking back now, what do you wish had happened instead? What would have prevented you from getting to those places?
It's hard to say. I mean, I didn't know where to go when I was in trouble in Singapore. I didn't know where to go when I was in trouble in London, other than, speaking to friends. I didn't know what options are available. I mean, beyond picking up the phone to an SOS telephone service like Samaritans, for example, I really had no idea, because I figured these actions have come about for a number of reasons. It's not just because I'm out of a job or because I've split up from my long-term girlfriend. There's a lot more going on here. And when I started to dig, we talked about that box in the stand. When I started to dig, with each shovel, I realized there was some real deep underlying reasons. And for me to get to those was going to require a bit of a strategy. It's going to require a plan, and the plan would involve individuals that are trusted, professionals, reading, studying, listening, learning, listening to also the voices in my head. So it had to become a plan, Phil, and even today, the plan continues. The journey evolves with every day.
So tell us a bit about your recovery then. What got you onto that road?
Yeah, I mean, after I left Ealing Hospital after that second attempt, and I was on sort of, crisis management, if you will, and the medication, lots of medication, etc. And I was living with my sister at the time. I had a room, and the Brent mental health, crisis team, they'd come see me 2-3 times a week, and they were brilliant. It was weird. I was just living in a room, a little bit smaller than what I am now. I didn't have any chairs in the room. I was sat on the bed. 2-3 of them come stand in front of me, half an hour, 2-3 times a week. And they just wanted to talk and find out how I was doing, and to make sure I was taking the medication was their main priority. And after about 2 or 3 weeks, I said, okay, Chris, let's talk about what signposting looks like. Let's talk about some of the things that we could, direct you towards. And this is going to require you to do your own research, require you to pick up the phone and make some inquiries, but we're going to help open some doors for you, because that's what we do. And I was like, okay, that sounds good. And I was encouraged by that, Phil, because for the first time I felt like somebody was invested in me. I felt as though somebody was listening and they were paying attention. And you know what the first thing they said, oh, do you know what a recovery college is? I said, I've no idea. He said, well, let's recommend you refer you to the Brent Recovery College. And what they do is they have all these courses, and bear in mind, this was the middle of COVID. So they have all these online courses that you can sign up to. And the idea is they're all, all the folks that go on these courses are like lived experience. They all have mental health problems, and you get classes of 12, 15 people, and they're facilitated by individuals who also have lived experience. And I thought, oh, that sounds quite good. And then when I spoke to the enrollments officer, who I'll never forget her, and she said to me, Chris, the whole recovery college purpose is to turn recovery into discovery. And the moment she said that, I said to her, it was almost like a light bulb moment had come on in my brain. I thought, those words will echo in my mind now forever. And the fact I'm sharing that with you today, it was almost like she said it yesterday. And I still use that phrase. And so I started to talk to people on the screen, started to not feel so alone. And then from there, I started to write. And then I got into the world of advocacy and lived experience and public patient involvement work. But underpinning all of that is this whole aspect of loneliness and social isolation, which I still grapple with today, because I spend about 95% of the time on my own. And I often ask myself, after so many years of being on my own, and I'm 55, am I ever going to find love again? Am I going to die alone? If I've got another 20, 30 years to live, do I want to be like this? Some of these questions, they do keep me up at night, and I worry about them, I tell you. Yeah. I worry about what the future might hold. Yeah.
But that experience then, and talking to the psychologists and your experience, Brent, and through the recovery college, that obviously helped you. And what was that point where you thought, right, I'm actually going to take this and become a kind of mental health advocate myself?
A champion for the people.
Champion, yes.
Because I kept challenging myself to think about, number one, what was going to get my arse out of bed in the morning? Number two, what was going to keep the suicidal thoughts at bay, to give me a purpose, to give me a reason to want to keep living? And how on earth was I going to make use of 30 years of private sector skills and experience in sales and business development and so on and so forth? And so, you know what I did? I said to myself one day, it was August 15th, I'll never forget it. I sat in front of my laptop. I'd never really done anything on ChatGPT before, so I was still really new to it. And I sat with a plain sheet of paper and I started to scribble down, okay, I need a project for 3 months. A project that's going to require me to talk to people, and it's going to require me to share my story and to write a lot of stuff. And so at least I can get out of my bed and be at my desk for about 4 hours a day. So I put all that stuff into ChatGPT and I said, what do you reckon? He said, well, why don't you do a lived experience project? And it will tick all those boxes. And I said, all right, well, that sounds good. What should we call it then? He goes, well, he said, oh, you like music, like soul music? And I was like, yeah, like a bit of walking. I said, all right, well, Project Soul Stride. I was like, oh, I really like that. And I sort of wrote it down and I thought, oh, this is not going to last. This is just going to be 3 months. I'm going to chuck it in the bin. Who cares? And Project Soul Stride was born, Phil, on August 15th. And what started off as a project targeting 30 people over the course of 15 months, I ended up interviewing 185 individuals across the country, but also into Africa and India and Australia, New Zealand, North America, Europe, about black men's mental health and suicide prevention. And the body of work that's been built from that has enabled me to ripple, the term I use, ripple out all the other advocacy work that I do. And now, I mean, there are opportunities popping up all the time, because when you start talking about this stuff, and particularly if you're a black man, individuals will identify with you and say, okay, can you do this? Can you partner with us on that? And we need you to do that. And I'm like, and so right now, my portfolio is very busy and it's exciting. So I'm just hoping I'm making a difference, Phil. That's all. I'm hoping I'm making a difference out there.
And you talk about bridge building. So, expand on that then.
Yeah. I mean, the recent article I did for MHIN, the Bridge Builder, also the Bridge Keeper, was in essence, the philosophy around Project Soul Stride was to find a way. It's almost like a theory of change arc, right? It's to find a way to plonk the voice of lived experience in the middle of a sector and being able to not only identify all the different stakeholders, but to be able to get them to connect with each other, right? So, for example, starting off talking to folks in the NHS, but then I'll say to the NHS, where do you get your intelligence from? Oh, okay. Well, we get it from, white papers or the academic sector. Okay. So I'm now going to talk to the academic sector, talk to the theorist and say, do you ever speak to people with lived experience? No, we don't. Okay. Because your white papers are great for academics, but they don't speak well to the man on the street who needs to learn this stuff or maybe has an interest in this stuff. And so I started to actually connect the dots with Project Soul Stride essentially becoming like a communication gateway. And I think that's why the Soul Stride LinkedIn page is doing so well, is because I've got people now from all over the world, from all different backgrounds. The other day, there was a bloke who works on a ship. He works on a ship, this bloke. And obviously he's seen something I've said, and he himself, I think, may have had some problems. And he's now following Project Soul Stride's page because he maybe sees himself in my content. So I've got MBEs and OBEs and all those big wigs, and then I've got academics and I've got social influencers and I've got all sorts of people. And for me, I just want to build the bridges. I want to get people talking to each other, help reduce stigma, tell their stories. That's what I love. Yeah.
And are you signposting then? So you've got this huge amount of content, stories, shared stories from men all over the world. And what's the advice or how are you? What are you saying to them is the action they can tell? Where are they going for help?
Yeah. So one thing that, and this is where some people might get confused, what Soul Stride is, it is not a mental health signposting platform, because there are many out there that have that done. And I myself am a user of those, signposting boards. So it would not have made any sense for me to do that. The whole purpose of Soul Stride is an education platform, to help direct individuals who have an interest in this subject to know where to go to read content, to know which events they should attend, to know which individuals are considered experts in the field. They're the individuals that you should follow. So really, as my old boss in in Singapore used to say, I'm the sort of king of connecting. You know, Enkish, for example, has an event coming up where they're going through their latest suicide figures. Now, I'm going to be going to that, of course, but I dropped that into the Soul Stride page because I know that there are people there who may not even know who Enkish is, but they're now going to register on that event because they think, oh, hold on, there's going to be stuff there that I want to learn as well. So I want to educate people. Yeah.
So this is probably not too similar to what we're trying to do with this podcast, actually. So it's, you know, making the discussion far more open, normalizing it, and, you know, as I said earlier, making uncomfortable conversations actually comfortable and not shying away from them.
Exactly.
And tell me then, so I know you focus on the needs of black men experiencing, you know, poor mental health. What's the, you know, talk a bit about that then. So are there different, you know, approaches, or, you know, are there different needs, or, you know, how are you addressing that community specifically?
No, absolutely. I mean, I think, you know, when I first started to attend events, on suicide prevention, you know, annual events, webinars, etc., I would often be the only black face on the screen, because this again was during COVID. And you know what, Phil, the pressure that puts on you if you've got questions as a black man, listening to experts on the screen who are all white, who are all middle-aged, you'd actually start to convince yourself that suicide is only a white middle-aged man's problem, because there's no black men on the screen. But I know full well that there are black men out there who have gone as far as wanting to take their lives or self-harm, you know, or maybe they turn to drugs as a coping mechanism, or alcohol, or they beat their wives because they don't know how else to express their stress and so on and so forth, their fear, you know. So it's a very different type of, you know, community and environment. And so what I wanted to do firstly was to be brave enough, and this was really a major hurdle for me, was to be brave enough to actually start speaking out and up at these events to say, actually, I've got something to say. I think it's going to be of value. And then encouraging other voices to come to the table and join the conversation. And so it's been a way for me to shine a light on this topic that has been woefully underserved from a research perspective, and a data collection perspective. It's been woefully underserved. And so, you know, the whole idea was to be able to find other black men who are willing to talk about this stuff, because mostly they will be behind the veil. They don't want to talk about this stuff because for them it's like there's so much stigma, and it's all this, you know, I'm the man, you know, that sort of toxic masculinity, and not being able to talk about it at home to their mum or dad who come from Africa or the Caribbean, or their wives. So I'm trying to just demonstrate, no matter how difficult these topics are, through writing, through speaking, through sharing, we can find ways to heal as a community. And there are other black men out there who I hold in high regard, who are doing an extraordinary job, some of which I revere. You know, I've only been doing this for a year and a half, and there are guys out there who've been doing it for a lot longer, and I look up to these guys. So I just want to be able to pass the baton on and hope somebody younger than me picks it up at some point, and off we go again, you know.
So if it wasn't difficult enough, kind of getting men to open up, when you throw in the cultural constraints, I guess, with the community you're working with, it makes it doubly difficult, I guess, or more difficult.
Yeah, no, it does, because the conversation invariably goes towards racism. And that's actually a term. I know people say we shouldn't run away from that term, and I get it. But actually it's a term that I very rarely use in my work, because there's the racism movement that's going on, the anti-racism movement which I follow, I admire it. But my movement is around therapeutic services. It's around storytelling. It's around, you know, cultural competency, cultural humility. So I'm attacking the issue from a different perspective. And when you are talking to other black men, actually, it's quite difficult to get them to steer away from the racism angle and look perhaps more at solutions and other perspectives. And that's actually, it's a challenge even for me, but it's a challenge that I'm still learning. And it's actually quite a good challenge to have, actually. Yeah.
So what do we need to do to change things, Chris? It's 2025, the topic is raised, that's highlight, more people talk about it, but yet I'm not sure it's really, when you look at the numbers of people still, depression or other sorts of mental health illnesses and, the suicide rates, it's, what do we need to change?
There's a few ways in which I could answer this. One of the things I keep coming back to, Phil, is access to healing spaces. And when I talk about healing spaces, non-clinical healing spaces, if we could label it things like crisis cafes, for example, or, on my mind map board here, I've got things like healing circles, emotional emancipation circles, which is a really cool term, community connectors, peer support groups. There's a whole line of notes I've got on this mind map. And all of that says to me that if we could find a way to create safe spaces at, the church or the community center where I look at countries like Zimbabwe, or other low middle income countries where the whole concept of Ubuntu, which was, finding healing through connection, sitting around the campfire, telling stories and sharing your troubles. It's something that has been lost in the Western world. And I think if we could find a way to almost turn the clock back and take the best of what we have now, but make it more accessible to everybody. I do CBT because I can't, and it's free for me, on the NHS. If I had the money, somebody asked me the other day, Chris, if you had all the cash to pay for a private clinician, do you think you'd be any further along now than you are going through NHS CBT? I said, actually, it's a really good question. I don't know if I would, because at the end of the day, they're all doing the same thing. Obviously, methodologies might vary, but maybe I don't know if I would. What I haven't had the chance to do is to go and sit in a park with a bunch of men and play cards or chess. And while we're doing that, talk about what's going on in our lives. Talk about love and relationships and families. Doing that 2 hours a week for me would be a godsend, man. Seriously. And I think, how difficult can it be to create spaces like that? Not very few I can't find anywhere, Phil. I don't even know. I'm sure they exist, but I've not been able to find. Have you found any of these places?
Well, there are, just through doing this podcast, there are groups. I mean, there's things like the Men's Shed Association. There are, I've talked to folks in the US, and there are kind of similar kind of exercise, activity-based organizations. They do exist, absolutely, but I'm not sure how accessible they are all over the place. They've got pockets of them. And of course there are, mainstream charities like Andy's Man Club, etc. So they do exist. But I just wonder if, mental health as a crisis, I guess, is so broad and affects so many people, it probably is not enough. And as you said, just something very informal, just something that fits into your week. That's not even, because I think a lot of men perhaps wouldn't go to something which was like a mental health chat. But if it was just, as you said, sitting in the park, talking about life, having a coffee, maybe we need to embed that more into our communities, is exactly as you said.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, of course, you could layer that around system-wide change, cultural humility, and, having lived experience at decision-making tables. I think as I say, I'm still quite new to this movement, but what I'm beginning to see is quite major change happening, and it's happening quite rapidly around embedding and integrating the voice of lived experience into the system-wide thinking. And I'm just proud to be part of that conversation, really. Yeah.
So let me ask you lastly then, Chris, people who are listening to this and who, your story resonates, perhaps, your experience, wanting to take your own life, and I appreciate, you're not a therapist or a psychologist, but based on your experience, what advice would you give to somebody who's listening to this now, or somebody who knows, somebody who they think is struggling? What advice?
The first thing I'd say, Phil, is you are not weak. You are not alone. Regardless of how you've been brought up or what you might see or witness around you when it comes to masculinity, the image of the modern man, don't worry about it. Forget about it, because at the end of the day, you're worth more to yourself, your friends, your family, your loved ones, future spouse, etc., etc. You're worth more if you can just show that level of vulnerability. And as much as your hands will shake, your voice will shake. That first time you ask for help, that first time you ask for somebody just to listen to you as if you are the only person in the world, it can make so much difference. And you try, be creative. I would say is be curious, be willing to experiment and try lots of different tools, of which there are many. Your phone has tools, the YouTube has tools, men's magazines have tools. Be curious, challenge yourself, because at the end of the day, you only have yourself to answer to. So just remember, you're not weak, yeah, and you're not alone, is what I would say, yeah.
Thank you, Chris. You've been so honest and open with us. It's been brilliant. Thank you for coming on and talking to us. And all the best. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Midlife Men podcast with me, Philip Briscoe. If you're affected by Chris's story, if you or someone you know is in immediate danger or experiencing a crisis, there are organisations you can call now. In the UK, you can call the Samaritans on 116 123. And in the US, you can call the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. There are also many other organisations that provide communities for men, including the Men's Sheds Association and Tough to Talk in the UK. And in the US, there's the Face It organisation and F3 Nation. You can find out more about Chris's work, including Project Soul Stride, at his All Links page, so allmylinks.com/Chris Frederick. If you have stories to tell you think your experience would help others, then please do get in contact with me either via the website, mid-lifemen.com, or email me at midlifemen01@gmail.com. If you enjoyed listening, then please do rate and review the podcast. And finally, there's now a book called Men Speak Up, Journeys Through Mental Health, which is based on the podcast and available to buy on Amazon and through other online retailers.